Julian Vance, her ex-husband, took the bakery she built from the ground up, took the delivery vans, and took both of their children, leaving Clara stranded on the street with nothing but a rusted baking pan and $35. 11 months later, she stood in front of a national TV camera. Julian was watching. He was not ready for what he saw. 4 a.m., red coals, cold air, a bag of flour, a metal ruler bent at one end. She did not plan to sell bread on a sidewalk. She baked because it was the only thing her hands still owned. And the thing Julian threw away as scrap metal was the one thing that was about to take everything back from him. In front of the entire country, let me tell you how a woman with $35 and a bent ruler dismantled a man worth 9 figures. Not with a lawyer, not with a scream, with bread. The morning the locks changed, Clara Vance was 41 years old, and she had clean hands for the first time in 12 years. That is the detail nobody tells you about losing everything. There was no flour under her nails, no starter dried into the creases of her knuckles. Her hands looked like somebody else's hands, soft, useless, the hands of a woman who had signed where she was told. She sat on the curb outside the house on Collier Road in Atlanta, and she counted what she had. 1 rusted iron baking pan, 1 blue coat from a thrift store in Memorial Drive that still smelled faintly of someone else's cigarettes, $35 on a corporate debit card that Julian could freeze with 1 tap of his thumb, and in the right pocket of that coat, wrapped in a flannel rag, an iron ruler exactly 12 inches long with a hammer dent struck into the top edge. She sat there long enough that the porch light Julian never changed clicked off on its timer. Through the front window she could see the marble island where, for 12 years, she had wiped flour off the counter before his guests arrived. She could see the wall where the locksmith's invoice still lay on the entry table. The children's bikes were gone from the side yard. He had moved them to the new place already. Fast, the way you move evidence. 11 years she had lived in that house. It took a locksmith 40 minutes to make it not hers. Julian had taken the bakery. He had taken the lease on the flagship store on Peachtree. He had the corporate titles, the Delaware Holding Company, the deed to the house signed over to a trust managed by his own brother-in-law. He had Leo, 11. He had Mia, 7. He had the German sedan with the seats that smelled of money. But he had not looked behind the spare flour sacks on the bottom shelf of the pantry. So he had left the ruler. To Julian, it was junk. To Clara, it was the baseline of every calculation her family had made for 3 generations. He just did not know that yet. Neither did she, not fully. Not until a courtroom 11 months later. Hold that ruler in your mind. It comes back. It comes back in a way that turns a billion-dollar trade secret case into a pile of dead paper. A woman named Martha pulled up to that curb in a blue sedan that did not rattle when it crossed the railroad tracks near Glenwood. Martha had worked 41 years at the commercial mills north of the city. She did not ask Clara what happened. She knew what a sudden erasure looked like. She knew the silence that comes after a signed decree. The water takes 3 minutes to get hot, Martha said, by way of welcome. The couch folds out. The spring on the left side is broken. Sleep on the right. Clara nodded. She did not cry. She had stopped crying somewhere around page 19 of the divorce filing when she realized her name was not on a single asset she had built. Have you ever been made to feel like a guest in a life you constructed with your own 2 hands? Keep that feeling close. You are going to need it. Here is what the family court never said out loud. For 3 years, Julian had run their marriage like a balance sheet. He canceled her independent credit cards for tax optimization. He issued her a corporate debit card with a fixed weekly limit of $300. Groceries above that required a purchase order he had to clear. He moved the cash flow of the bakery into a holding account in Delaware. He transferred the house into a trust. 1 asset at a time, he hollowed out the marriage while she was in the fermentation room, counting grams of water. The lawyers had a clean phrase for what he did to the money. They never used the older, uglier phrase for what he did to her. Coercive control. Financial abuse. The slow, patient theft of a person's ability to walk out the door. It does not leave a bruise. It leaves a woman on a curb with $35 and clean, useless hands. Martha's basement apartment smelled of damp mortar and dryer sheets. No windows facing the street. One small vent near the ceiling that showed the tires of passing delivery vans. Clara lay on the right side of the broken couch and listened to the building's water heater hum. Dry. Mechanical. Without variation. The sound of a system designed by someone else, running in the dark. She did not sleep. She held the ruler. And somewhere under the city, the oldest part of her brain, the part her grandfather had built, started doing math. But to understand the ruler, you have to go back. Way back. To a black neighborhood in the mountains that a bank tried to erase before Clara was even born. But here is what Julian never understood about the woman he married. He thought her recipes lived in the notebooks he stole. They did not. They lived in her hands. And her hands were trained on Avery Street in Asheville, North Carolina, in a workshop that should not have survived at all. Clara grew up on Avery Street, in the historically black South Side district, in a house that smelled of yeast, burnt oak, and caramelized sugar. The ovens belonged to her grandfather, Arthur Ellison, born 1938. He ran 3 wood-fired hearths behind a timber mill for 47 years. He never owned a digital scale. He never used a timer that beeped. He timed his loaves by the smell of the steam leaving the chimney and the exact color of the embers under the floor stones. In the spring of 1961, Arthur Ellison put on his only pressed shirt, folded a 4-page business plan into a clean envelope, and walked into a bank on Pack Square with $2.40 in his pocket. He had practiced the numbers for a month, cost per sack, yield per oven, the exact margin on a dozen loaves. He could have recited it in his sleep. The loan officer never asked for a single figure. He set Arthur's envelope aside unopened and pulled a map across the desk instead. On that map, the south side, Arthur's street, Arthur's church, the lot where Arthur wanted to build, was shaded a flat, deliberate red. Red was the bank's color for the neighborhoods it would not lend a dime to. Red meant the people who lived inside that line were a risk decided by the line itself before any of them opened their mouths. The officer slid the map back, said the bank wasn't doing business in that corridor this year, and looked at his watch. Arthur did not argue. He had learned a long time before that arguing with a man holding a map was a way to lose an afternoon. He took his unopened envelope home, sat at his kitchen table, and did the only math left to him. So he built the ovens himself, brick by brick, on weekends. With money he saved cutting hair on Saturdays and laying brick for other men's houses the rest of the week. It took him 3 years, and the day he ran out of money for a proper baker scale, he walked into a salvage yard off Riverside and bought a 12-inch iron machinist's ruler for a nickel, because a nickel was what he had. The ruler already had a dent in it, a hammer strike near the zero end from whatever life it had lived before his. A machine shop, a tool chest, somebody else's hands. A different man would have filed it flat or thrown it back in the bin. Arthur did neither. He learned the dent. He measured against it every day for 47 years until the flaw became the rule, until 2 over was carved into his hands deeper than it was struck into the metal. He built an entire craft around the exact thing the world would have discarded. Remember that choice. It is the whole story. Clara was 9 the first time he let her shape a loaf alone. She measured it dead straight off the metal tip, the way any sensible child would. Proud of the clean 9 inches, Arthur picked it up, turned it in the firelight, and set it back down. "Too short," he said. "It'll burn before the metal's awake. Use the dent. Always the dent." Why is the ruler broken? Granddaddy? He smiled at that, the only time she could ever remember him smiling at a question instead of a loaf. It's not broken, baby. It just knows something the new ones don't. He tapped the hammer mark with one cracked thumbnail. Anybody can read the numbers. Take somebody who paid attention to read the mistake. He was sick the last winter she had with him, the breath rattling out of him a little more each morning. But he came down to the ovens every day until he couldn't. The night before he passed, he pressed the ruler and the canvas ledger into her hands with fingers gone thin as kindling. "They'll try to tell you the worth's in the paper," he said. "It never is. The paper's just where you write down what your hands already know. You hear me? Keep the dent. Tell your own. He died before sunrise. He never owned a thing the bank would have counted as an asset. He left his granddaughter a flawed ruler, a taped-up notebook, and a craft no map could draw a line around. And a dozen years later, a man with a Harvard certificate on the wall would look at all of it and see nothing but scrap. Clara spent her 5th winter on an upturned crate by the loading bay, watching flour dust settle on the old man's flannel shoulders. He did not give her toys to keep her quiet. He gave her an iron bowl and a handful of rye. "Listen to the wood," he used to say, his voice dried flat by decades of heat. "Pine burns fast. Quick flash on the surface, no coals underneath. Oak holds the center. You want the sugar to go dark without going bitter. You wait for the oak to turn to gray ash. You don't rush it. Nobody honest ever rushed a fire." By 9, Clara could read the moisture in a sack of wheat by squeezing a handful between her thumb and palm. Clumps like wet clay, 3% less water, falls apart like river sand, more yeast, 20 more minutes in the proof box. She learned to read fire before she learned to read a tax map. Arthur kept his system in a narrow ledger with a water-stained canvas cover. The spine repaired with waxed thread because he could not afford a new one. 3 columns on every page. Outside temperature, wood type, exact weight of the salt. In the margins, in soft graphite, wind out of the north. Close the damper halfway. More steam at the 10-minute mark. And, on the last page he ever wrote, in a hand gone shaky, the dent is the secret. Measure long. Always 2 over. Tell the girl. Clara was 23 when he died. She carried the iron ruler and the canvas ledger in the bottom of a duffel bag to Atlanta, because a man named Julian Vance had promised her a partnership. He had an economics degree from Emory, a Harvard executive education certificate framed on the wall, and a clean test kitchen in Buckhead with white tile and computerized temperature controls. The old way doesn't scale, Julian told her, sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns. You can't build a company on the smell of wood smoke. We need repeatability. We need data. She believed him. God help her, she believed him. And for 12 years she handed him everything her grandfather built, while a bank that once drew a red line around her family quietly financed the man erasing her name. But the dent. He never knew about the dent. Keep watching. So here is the moment the trap closed, and like every real trap, it closed with a pen, not a fist. The incorporation papers came to the Buckhead facility on a Tuesday in October. Clara was testing the moisture retention of a new unbleached flour shipment, her hands gloved in starter. Julian laid 42 pages on a stainless table next to a 60-quart mixing bowl. The paper was crisp. No flour dust on it. Nothing he touched ever had flour dust on it. "Sign the lower line," he said, handing her a heavy black pen. "Standard corporate structure. It isolates our personal assets from the business liability." She wiped her palm on her apron and signed where he pointed. She did not read it. She did not know the document created 2 tiers of stock. Julian held 100% of the Class A voting shares. Clara was listed as a non-voting technical consultant. To the state of Georgia, Julian was the company. Clara was an operating expense. The silence in that room was the same silence that would follow her into a courtroom. The silence of people who find it easier to watch. For 12 years, that silence had a Sunday ritual. Every other Sunday, Julian hosted his investors, and twice a year, the big one. A private dinner in a back room at one of those restaurants where the tasting menu costs more than Clara's grandfather made in a month. 11 Madison Park, 1 year. A private floor of the St. Regis the next. Clara spent the Saturday before each one in the home kitchen, on Collier Road, building the pre-ferments by hand, babysitting a wild culture for 18 hours so the hearth loaves would be perfect. She remembers one in particular. A spring dinner, 9 investors, a wine the sommelier introduced by vintage, Julian at the head of the table in a Tom Ford jacket with a Patek, Philippe catching the candlelight every time he gestured. The bread came out on a walnut board. Her bread, her grandfather's slow ferment crumb, the crust singing as the server set it down. A woman across the table closed her eyes at the first bite and asked Julian where it came from. "We're building an artisan profile for the North Side location," Julian said. He did not look toward the kitchen door, where Clara stood in an apron holding the next board. "Proprietary process. Took us years to dial in the data." Us. Ross. The data. Clara had cultivated that culture from a jar she carried out of Asheville in a duffel bag. She had read the humidity off the back of her own hand at 4,000 morning, and in a room of 9 well-dressed people, not one of them turned to ask the woman in the doorway a single question. She set down the board. She refilled the water. She wiped the flour from the marble before the next course. She was, in that room, exactly what the incorporation papers said she was, an operating expense in an apron. Did anyone see her? The server saw her. The investor's wife caught her eye for half a second and looked away, the way you look away from something that isn't your business. That is how erasure actually works, not in one cruel stroke, in 100 small rooms where everyone finds it easier to watch the bread than the woman who made it. She told herself it was a partnership. She told herself her name would come later, after the expansion, after the next round, after the next. She was building a man's empire, one 18-hour culture at a time, and she would not understand until a courtroom told her so, that to the state of Georgia, she had never existed at all. Did anyone in that first kitchen say a word the day she signed away her shares? The line cooks saw it. The shift manager saw it. They looked at their stations. They looked at the floor. Nobody said, "Clara read it first." The last document came on a Thursday, 6 weeks before the locks changed. Clara was shaping 72 sourdough loaves. Julian walked in with a charcoal Tom Ford coat he did not bother to remove, and a young associate from his firm, a paralegal named Daniel Okafor, who carried a clean clipboard and would not meet anyone's eyes. "Non-compete covenant," Julian said. "Flat as a closed door. The bank requires it before they approve the expansion loan. It protects our recipes." "Julian, these are my grandfather's formulas," Clara said. She did not put down the dough. "They've been in my family since 1938. On paper, they belong to the corporation." He looked at the paralegal, not at her. "The company paid for the development. If you don't sign, the credit line freezes, the bakery fails." The covenant barred her from any commercial baking within 100 miles of Atlanta for 5 years if her relationship with the corporation ever ended. She read 3 lines. She thought about Leo's braces and Amia's inhaler. She signed. The paralegal, Daniel, looked down, not at her face, at her shoes, at the flour dusted across the worn toes of shoes she had resoled twice. Something moved across his face and then went still. He clicked his pen. He said nothing. "Write his name down too. Daniel Okafor. He is going to remember those shoes. In about 9 months, that memory is going to cost Julian Vance everything." 6 weeks later, in Fulton County Family Court, Julian's attorney slid a consolidated financial sheet to Judge Eleanor Maynard. It showed Clara had no independent income. Her name was on no lease, no mortgage, no equity. $35 on a debit card and a history of unpaid technical work. "The court must consider the material stability of the minors," Judge Maynard said, gavel resting on the bench. "Temporary primary custody is awarded to the father. The mother will have supervised visitation on alternate weekends, contingent on a verifiable address and a stable income." Julian did not look back. He walked out through the double-glass doors flanked by his legal team. Clara sat alone at the defense table with her clean, useless hands. And not one person in that gallery, not the clerk, not the bailiff, not the lawyers, looked at her either. Stable income, verifiable address. The court had just told a woman with $35 exactly what she needed to get her children back, so she went and got it. From a bag of flour and a dead church. The Route 26 bus dropped Clara at Northside Drive and 10th Street at 412A North Side at 412A Mere. The wind off the concrete corridor smelled of diesel and wet dust. She carried one brown grocery bag, a 25-pound sack of bread flour for $18.50, a $4 jar of dry yeast, a $1 carton of salt, $11.50 left. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, and she did not put on gloves. Gloves dull the touch. She needed to feel the pavement. She walked 2 blocks to St. Jude's, an Episcopal parish built in 1924, dark for 9 years, its stained glass boarded over with plywood and rusted drywall screws. Behind the fellowship hall, under a rotted canvas awning, sat an old brick barbecue hearth, its chimney choked with ivy, its grate crusted with a decade of char. The pastor, Father Thomas, was 72 and lived in the rectory next door. He gave her the key to the back gate and asked for nothing. "Inspector hasn't been here since the city cut the gas line," he said from his porch. "Call it a community kitchen. If people leave a donation in a tin, code enforcement can't write you up for selling. But don't sell off the front steps. The call center flags a sidewalk bakery inside a day." "I'll clean the flue every morning," Clara said. She spent 2 hours scraping old fat from the fire brick with the sharp edge of her grandfather's ruler. She could not afford $30 for seasoned oak, so she cut up 4 pine construction pallets from a dumpster behind a tire shop with a handsaw she found in Martha's basement. Pine is resinous. It pops. It sparks. It throws a sharp chemical smoke that blackens the brick throat in minutes. But it was dry, and it was free. At 5:30, she mixed her first batch in the rusted iron pan she had carried off Collier Road. No scale. She poured flour onto the cold metal, hollowed the center with 3 fingers, added cold tap water from the rectory spigot. Cold water slows the yeast and forces the starch into lactic acid over a longer rise. The slow ferment Arthur practiced through the lean winters of the 1940s. Dense gray crumb, sour profile, bread that keeps 4 days with no preservative. She divided the mass into 12 oblong portions. And here is where the dead man reached forward through 80 years and put his thumb on the scale. She measured each loaf against the notched edge of his ruler. Not from the metal tip. From the dent. She laid the dough to the hammer mark and cut at the 9-inch line, which meant every loaf came out 2 millimeters longer than a true 9 inches. 2 millimeters over. Always 2 over. Measure long, the ledger said. She did not even think about why anymore. Her hands knew. 2 over. The dent does the math. 2 millimeters. Remember that number. It is going to walk into a courtroom and burn a man's entire empire to the ground. By 6:15, the pine had burned to a shallow bed of orange embers. Volatile heat. No steady core. She had no wooden peel. So, she wrapped her forearms in wet rags, leaned her whole torso into the smoking throat of the oven, and set the loaves on the bare stone with her bare palms. The heat singed the hair off her wrists. The air went bitter with scorched flour and pine soot. The first 6 burned on the bottom. The resin had made a hot spot near the left wall, over 500 degrees before she could rotate them. She did not throw them out. She scraped the blackened crust off with a metal scraper until the gray steaming interior showed through. Salvaged 6 loaves. 6. At 7 ohm, the first shift arrived at the construction site across the street, a 6-story luxury complex going up behind green chain link. 11 drywall installers, boots white with gypsum, breath fogging in the autumn chill. Clara carried the 6 salvaged loaves on a board she'd wiped with vinegar. She set it on a low retaining wall by the gate and put an empty coffee tin beside it, a slot cut in the lid. "Hot hearth bread," she said, not loud, no vendor's pitch. $2, or whatever's in your pocket. A man with a silver mustache, name tag reading Hector, looked over the wall. He looked at the charcoal on her face, the blistered crust of the bread. He dropped 2 crumpled bills in the tin and broke a loaf in half with his bare hands. Steam rushed out, smelling of wild yeast and clean grain. "This tastes like the stone ovens back home," Hector said to the man behind him. "This is real, not the white sponge from the gas station." By 7:45, the tin held $22, every loaf gone. She did not go back to Martha's to rest. She rode the 26 down to the warehouse on Marietta with $43.50 and bought 2 sacks of flour, 5 pounds of rye, and a box of baking soda to scrub the soot. It was not a business plan. It was arithmetic for survival. There was a morning in the second week she almost quit. The cold had come down hard overnight, and the demolition timber she'd scavenged was wet to the core. The fire wouldn't hold. The embers died under the loaves twice, and twice she pulled out 40 raw, sagging things that no one would pay $1 for. Her hands were cracked open across the knuckles from the cold and the lye in the scrubbing soda, and one of the splits had started to bleed into the dough. And she stood in the gray 5 o'clock light of a dead church and thought, very clearly, I cannot do this. I am 41 years old and I am losing to a campfire. Then she heard her grandfather. Not really, but the way you hear someone who taught you. Nobody honest ever rushed a fire. She dumped the wet wood. She walked 4 blocks to a closed barbecue joint, knocked on the back door, and bought a half cord of seasoned oak off the pitmaster for $20. Cash and a promise of bread. The next batch came out perfect. She sold every loaf. She did not quit. And she never used wet wood again. Here is what nobody at that fence knew she was really baking for. It was not the money exactly. It was a number on a court order, verifiable address, stable income. Judge Maynard had handed her a checklist for getting her children back, and every loaf in that coffee tin was one line item closer. Her first supervised visitation came on a Saturday in the 3rd week. A county building, a beige room with a one-way window and a social worker named Ms. Pruitt taking notes on a clipboard in the corner. 2 hours. Leo came in careful, watchful, the way kids get when they've learned the adults can't be trusted to stay calm. Mia came in with her inhaler clipped to her belt loop and a drawing she'd made of a house with smoke coming out of a chimney. Is this our old house? Clara asked. No, Mia said. It's yours. The one with the bread. Leo told me about the fire. Clara had to turn her face to the window for a second, so the social worker wouldn't write down that the mother cried. She didn't cry. She got it back under glass and she asked Mia about the chimney and Leo about school. And she did not say one word against their father. Not one, even though the words were lined up behind her teeth like loaves on a board. When the 2 hours ended, Mia held on at the door longer than she was supposed to, and Ms. Pruitt looked up from the clipboard and, for the first time, did not write anything down. She just watched. And something in her face was not neutral anymore. Clara rode the Route 26 back to St. Lec. Jude's lit the fire at Forever the next morning. And bakes like the custody hearing was the next day. Because in her head, it always was. Day 3, 2 sacks, demolition timber from a tear down, 24 loaves, $48 in the tin. Day 7, 4 sacks, hickory offcuts from a cabinet shop, 48 loaves, $104. Second week, the scale jumped 8 sacks of organic hard wheat, $15 for real split oak at last, 96 loaves into the heat, $211 in a single morning. By the 3rd week, she did not need to stand at the gate. At 6:45, before the second batch came out of the brick, 16 men were already waiting in a silent line along the fence. They brought their own cloth bags. They left 5s instead of singles. They did not call it charity. They called it the Avery Street Loaf, after a street 4 hours north that none of them had ever seen. The name happened by accident, the way the good ones do. One frozen morning, Hector asked her, while he waited for the second batch, "Where'd you learn this?" "My abuela baked in a stone oven outside Morelia." "This is that." "Where's yours?" "Avery Street," Clara said, scraping ash. "Asheville. My grandfather's ovens. He bought this ruler for a nickel because the bank wouldn't loan a black man in his neighborhood enough to buy a real one." Hector was quiet a second. Then he turned to the man behind him and said, "Avery Street Loaf," like he was naming a thing into the world. By the end of the week it was on every man's lips, written on the cardboard sign, one of them taped to the fence without asking. Avery St. Calf. Loaf. Leave what you can. She left the sign up. The line stopped being a line and started being something else. A drywall installer named Quincy started showing up early to split her wood. No charge. Said his hands needed something honest to do before a shift hanging board. For people who'd never learn his name, a retired bus mechanic named Walter, who lived 2 doors from the church, brought a folding table the second week, so the older men wouldn't have to eat standing up. Somebody's wife sent a thermos of coffee, then 2. then a 50-cup earn. The county road crew that bought 4 loaves every Thursday started buying 8, because the second 4 went to a shelter on Pryor Street. These were not customers. Clara understood that, scraping her hearth in the dark. These were people the city had also drawn a quiet line around. The ones who built the luxury complex across the street and could never afford to live in it. The ones whose names nobody at the top of any table ever bothered to ask. They did not line up for cheap bread. They lined up because somebody was making something honest with her own hands, in the open, and letting them be part of it. Vicarious dignity, the same hunger that, a few weeks later, would make 4 million strangers furious on her behalf. End of the 4th week. Clara counted on the church steps. $1,280 in a canvas bank bag inside her suitcase. She had not violated the non-compete. On paper, she was no one's employee. She owned no corporation. She wrote no invoices. She was a woman baking bread in a charity kitchen, supported by the donations of 36 laborers. But the smoke from the St. Jude's chimney was climbing higher every morning. It was drifting over the interstate corridor, and smoke does not respect property lines. 4 miles south, that smoke was about to drift straight into the ventilation intake of Vance Bakery's corporate headquarters, and the man inside was about to make the first of 3 fatal mistakes. The smell of caramelized sugar and oak smoke does not stop for a chain-link fence, and by November the draft off the interstate carried Clara's hearth 4 miles down North Side Drive, right into the ventilation of the building where Julian Vance sat behind glass, watching his weekend numbers slip. He noticed the sales first. The Saturday ledger for the Buckhead store showed artisan transactions down 11%. To anyone else, a rounding error. To Julian, whose entire system was built on predictability, an 11% variance meant a competitor had entered the grid, and a competitor in his grid felt like an insect crawling across his clean white tile. He did not hire an investigator. He used his sister. Beatrice Vance owed Vance Enterprises $145,000 on a personal line she had drawn to clear her husband's cancer bills in Smyrna. Julian held the lien on her house. He held it the way he held everything, quietly, patiently, ready. "Go down to the St. Jude's lot Friday," he told her over the phone, tapping a silver pen against a Patek Philippe on his wrist. "Photograph the setup. Find out where she's sourcing flour. If she's running the Ellison Yeast culture, she's in violation of the IP clause, and I'll bury her in it." Friday, 6:30 a.m. Beatrice stood at the fence with her hands shaking inside her coat. Through the gray pine smoke, she watched Clara work, face streaked with charcoal, arms dusted white to the elbow, moving with a steady mechanical rhythm, lifting 48 loaves off the stone with a flat piece of scrap plywood. Beatrice did not see a broken ex-wife. She saw the engine that had built her brother's brand. And then Beatrice did something Julian never authorized. While Clara's back was turned, she folded a $20 bill around a scrap of paper and dropped it in the coffee tin. The paper said in a cramped hand, "I'm sorry. I always was." She did not sign it. She got in her car and texted Julian the cold version instead. No mixers, no signs, cells out of a coffee can, 60 people in line. She told herself the apology meant nothing. She was wrong about that too. 9 months from now, that single moment of conscience is going to put her in a witness box. Beatrice drove the 4 miles back to headquarters with her hands tight on the wheel and the smell of oak smoke still in her coat. She had grown up in the same house as Julian. She had watched her father run their mother's small catering business into a corporation with his name on it, and she had watched him do it with the exact flat, reasonable voice Julian used now. The voice that made theft sound like good governance. She knew that voice. She had spent her whole life being managed by it, and the lien on her house was just the latest version of the only language her family ever spoke to her in: behave or lose everything. She told herself she had no choice. She would keep telling herself that for 9 months. The note in the tin was the one true thing she did, and she did not even sign it. Up in his glass office, Julian read her text and felt something he had not felt in years and did not have a word for because the word was fear. A woman with a coffee can was costing him 11%. He pulled up the North Side store's projections. Then the artisan lines, 6 straight weeks of hearth test failures, and he could not connect the two, because the connection was a dent in a ruler 4 miles away. And he had thrown the ruler in a pantry. So he did the thing men like him always do when the numbers stop obeying. He reached for paper. He told his assistant to get the firm on the line. He was certain, absolutely certain, that anything a woman could build with her hands, a man with the right documents could take. He had been right about that for 12 years. He was about to be wrong about it on national television. Julian did not file a lawsuit. A lawsuit meant discovery, and discovery meant a forensic accountant crawling through his Delaware transfers. Instead, he chose administrative exhaustion. His firm drafted a 14-page cease and desist, bound in heavy blue paper, claiming Clara was running illegal commercial manufacturing in a restricted zone, violating zoning law, and stealing proprietary trade secrets belonging to Vance Bakeries. A corporate courier laid the blue envelope on the concrete wall beside the coffee tin at 7:15 on a Wednesday. Clara did not stop shaping dough. "I need your signature on the acknowledgement," the courier said. "I'm not signing anything," Clara said, not looking up. "Tell Julian the oven's hot. If he wants the smoke to stop, he can come down here and put out the fire himself." Here is the thing, Julian's 14 pages quietly depended on her not knowing. A non-compete signed under threat. Sign or the credit freezes and your family starves is signed under duress. A covenant that bars a woman from her own grandfather's craft across a 100-mile radius for 5 years is the kind of overbroad covenant courts strike down for breakfast. He was not holding a sword. He was holding a bluff printed on expensive paper. And Clara, scraping ash from a church hearth, had already decided she was done being afraid of paper. She slid the blue envelope under one leg of the wobbling prep table to level it, and went back to work. That was Julian's first mistake, sending paper to a woman who had already lost everything paper could take. His second mistake walked up to the fence 4 days later with a television camera. His second mistake had a name, and the name was not even his. It belonged to a reporter. And that reporter belonged to no one Julian could threaten. Yet, a food reporter named Marcus Bell, from the local Atlanta station, heard about the sidewalk line from a crew of county road workers who bought 4 loaves every Thursday. Marcus showed up at 5 Hesso Omors U5 wine. Marcus showed up at 500 pen. He did not want a corporate profile. He wanted a 2-minute human interest piece for the dinner hour. The camera caught the red coals against the dark frost, the heavy, blistered crust, the coffee tin, clinking with $5 bills. Marcus put the microphone in front of Hector, boots caked in white dust. "This isn't just bread," Hector said. "It's the only thing in this neighborhood that tastes honest. The big bakeries down the road sell us air and plastic. This woman gives us fire and grain." The segment aired Thursday night. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. By Friday morning, it had been clipped, uploaded, and viewed 200,000 times across the metro. The Avery Street loaf became a symbol, a single brick hearth standing against a corporate machine, comment sections filled with people who had been erased by an ex, a boss, a system, all of them suddenly furious on behalf of a woman they had never met. And Julian Vance, instead of letting it die, made his third mistake at $900 men that Friday. His legal team sent a second cease and desist, this one to the vice president of news at the station, threatening a multi-million-dollar Torious interference suit if they did not pull the segment from their site, claiming it promoted an illegal operation that infringed a valid non-compete. The news director did not pull it. He had spent 20 years covering municipal corruption in North Georgia, and he recognized corporate overreach by the weight of its letterhead. He assigned an investigative team to pull the Fulton County divorce records of Julian and Clara Vance, and he got help he did not expect. Remember the paralegal? The one who looked at Clara's worn shoes and said nothing? Daniel Okafor had not slept right in 6 weeks. He had watched a woman sign away her grandfather's craft beside a mixing bowl, and he had clicked his pen and held his clipboard and said nothing, because that was the job, because he had $80,000 in law school debt and a license he hadn't even finished earning yet. But he kept seeing the flour on her shoes, the way she'd resold them, the way Julian had looked at the legal assistant instead of at his own wife. The night the 8-minute investigation aired its first teaser, Daniel sat in his apartment in Decatur and pulled up the Vance file he still had access to. The 2-tier stock filing, the Delaware trust transfer, the consolidated financial sheet that told a family court judge a woman who built a company had no income. None of it was sealed. All of it was sitting there, true and quiet and damning. He thought about his license. He thought about his debt. He thought about his own grandmother, who'd cleaned houses in Macon for 30 years for people who never learned her name. Then he printed it all, drove to a post office 2 towns over, and mailed it to the station's news director with no return address and a single sticky note. Ask why her name is on nothing. He did not want a reward. He wanted to be able to look at his own hands again. He would not surface for 9 months, not until a deposition forced him to. But the envelope he mailed that night was the thread the whole investigation pulled. There was one more thread, and it would not show its base until the cascade. Somewhere in a suburb north of the city, a former Vance production manager named Renata Cho watched that first teaser, set down her coffee, and sat very still for a long time. She had signed a non-compete beside a mixing bowl 4 years earlier. She had told herself she was the only one. She was watching the proof on her own television that she never had been. By Monday evening, the 2-minute food review was gone, replaced by an 8-minute primetime investigation. The Quran did not mention bread. It read, "The Invisible COG, How a Corporation Erased the Woman We Jobij, the Woman We Build." It laid out the timeline. The Class A shares, the Delaware Holding Company, the $300 debit limit, the non-compete signed beside a mixing bowl, the deed signed to a brother-in-law's trust. And they ended on a single high-resolution photograph, the blue cease and desist envelope sitting on the soot-stained brick of St. Jude's. On one side, a 9-figure corporate network using the courts to freeze a single iron pan. On the other side, $35 in a bag of flour. The story did not stay local. By Wednesday, a national morning program had picked up the feed. The phrase Avery Street Loaf trended in 3 states. Julian Vance had tried to silence a woman with a coffee can. Instead, he had turned a dead church's backyard into the most watched square foot of real estate in the country. He had one move left. He filed the lawsuit he had been afraid to file. Trade secret theft. He was so certain the secret lived in the notebooks he had stolen that. He never once asked the only question that mattered. He never asked about the dent. He was about to ask it in open court, and the answer was going to drain the blood from his face on live television. Fulton County Superior Court, 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. The biggest food story in the country, and it came down to a room that smelled of floor wax and old paper. Julian sat at the plaintiff's table in a charcoal suit, 4 corporate lawyers behind him, 3 black binders full of patent filings, trademark registrations, and the signed non-compete. He wore the Patek. He had arrived in a Bentley Continental that 2 news crews filmed pulling into the deck. He looked, as he always looked, like a man who had already won. Clara sat at the opposite table. No legal team. The same thrift store blue coat. On the polished oak in front of her, a single object caught the fluorescent light and looked exactly like what Julian had always believed it to be, a piece of salvaged junk. Her grandfather's iron ruler. Julian's lead attorney rose and set a white box of commercial loaves on the evidence desk. "Your Honor, this is not a small business dispute. It is systematic trade secret theft. The defendant is using the exact hydration schedule, the exact fermentation cycle, and the proprietary yeast strain belonging to Vance Bakeries. We have the internal logs. We have the data." Judge Maynard looked over her glasses at the box, then at Clara. "The plaintiff claims your recipes are identical to their registered assets. What's your defense?" Clara stood. She did not go to the podium. She picked up the ruler. "They can't be identical," she said. "Flat, dry, the quiet flatness of the mountains." Julian took my paper notebooks from the Buckhead office. He gave them to his new head bakers. He thought the secret was in the ink. She walked to the evidence desk, took one of Julian's commercial loaves, and sliced it cleanly in half with a small metal scraper. His bakers use a digital caliper. They measure from a true 0 on a stainless bench. Exactly 9 inches. Perfect. She laid the ruler against the cut loaf. 9 inches. They did it right. A pause. 9 inches. They did it right. A pause. The room leaned in. My grandfather's ruler has a hammer dent at the 0 end. It was struck before he ever owned it, back in the 40s. He never filed it flat. He learned it. When you measure a loaf from this dent and cut at the 9-inch line, the loaf comes out 2 millimeters longer than a true 9 inches. 2 millimeters over. Every loaf my family has shaped for 3 generations has been 2 millimeters long. On purpose. Without anyone writing down why. She held the ruler up so the gallery could see the dent. In an electric convection oven, 2 millimeters is nothing. The heat is even. The loaf doesn't care. She pointed at Julian's perfect, exact 9-inch loaf. But a brick hearth is radiant heat. Uneven. A loaf 2 millimeters short has less core mass against that radiant wall. The crust sets and darkens before the steam pocket inside can finish lifting the crumb. The outside burns. The inside stays wet and falls. That is why Julian's new artisan line has failed in every wood-fired test for 6 weeks straight. He has all my formulas. He has the data. He has the notebooks. A beat. 1, 2. He just doesn't have the 2 millimeter mistake. And you can't steal a secret nobody ever knew was there. Watch what happened in that room, because it happened slowly, the way the important things do. Clara set the ruler down on the evidence desk. A flat clink of iron on wood carried to the back wall. A bailiff near the door stopped chewing his gum. One of Julian's 4 lawyers. The youngest, the one who actually knew bread chemistry because he'd done the patent. Filing, lowered his pen and did not pick it back up. He looked at the dent. Then he looked at the exact, perfect, doomed 9-inch loaf in the white box. Then he leaned over and whispered something to the lead attorney. And whatever he whispered made the lead attorney go very still. The lead attorney rose anyway, because that is what they pay him for. Your Honor, this is anecdotal. A story about a ruler. There is no documentation that any such tolerance was ever part of the protected process. Counselor, Judge Maynard said, you just argued my point for me. A pause. 1 second. 2. A trade secret has to be a secret your client knew he had, identified and protected. You're telling me the tolerance was never documented and your client never knew about it. She tapped her glasses against the bench. You can't steal what the owner himself didn't know existed. Sit down. He sat down. Silence. The real kind. The kind where 40 people in a gallery realize at the same moment that the small woman in the thrift store coat just took a billion-dollar argument apart with a nickel ruler and a slice of bread. The corporate lawyers did not look at their binders. They looked at the dent in a piece of scrap metal, and the entire architecture of their case quietly collapsed. Because trade secret law protects what a company has identified, guarded, and known to be a secret. You cannot register a flaw you do not know exists. You cannot own a tolerance that lives only in the muscle memory of a dead man's granddaughter. Julian had patented the recipe and lost the bread. Julian shifted in his chair. His hand tightened around the silver pen until his knuckles paled. But Clara was not finished. The trade secret case was the body. Now she went for the heart. Your Honor, I'd like to call Beatrice Vance. Julian's attorney shot up. Objection. The plaintiff's sister is not on the defense witness list. She was subpoenaed by this court as part of the documentary record submitted into evidence, Judge Maynard said. Overruled. Step up, Ms. Vance. Beatrice walked to the box pale as paper, a phone in her left hand. Eyes on the floor tile. She would not look at her brother. Beatrice, Clara said gently. From her table. Tell the court why you were at the St. Jude's fence in November. Beatrice took a breath the whole room heard. My brother holds the lien on my house in Smyrna, $145,000. He told me if I didn't photograph Clara's flower and copy her logs, he'd foreclose Monday morning. I have 47 text messages from his corporate account spelling out exactly that. She set the phone on the clerk's desk. The bailiff carried it up to the bench. For 3 full minutes, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft click of Judge Maynard's thumb scrolling through a text chain. Julian did not look at his lawyers. His face had gone the color of wet wood smoke, gray, bloodless, the color of a man watching his own paperwork turn on him. The judge set the phone down. She did not reach for the gavel. She leaned forward, and when she spoke, her voice was low and it cut. This court granted temporary custody of Leo and Mia Vanson, a presumption of material stability and corporate good faith. What I am reading is not stability. It is a deliberate, sustained pattern of economic abuse, engineered to strip a mother of her children and her livelihood through financial coercion and the threat of administrative ruin against her own family. She looked to Clara. The non-compete covenant is declared void for duress and overbreadth. The trade secret claim is dismissed with prejudice. Full legal and physical custody of the minors is restored to the mother, effective immediately. And the Georgia accounts of Vance Bakeries are frozen, pending a full forensic audit of the Delaware transfers. The gavel came down once, a single flat crack off the high walls. Court is adjourned. Clara did not smile. She did not look at Julian as his lawyers swarmed him in a panic of briefcases. She walked to the witness box, took Beatrice by the arm, and led her out through the double oak doors. And on the plaza steps, in the bright Atlanta morning, Martha was waiting with 2 children who broke into a run when they saw their mother's face. 11 years she had been an operating expense. It took 11 months and 2 millimeters to become a person again. But karma does not stop at a custody order. For a man like Julian Vance, it was just clearing its throat. You want to know what it costs to erase a woman? Let me show you the invoice. Karma does not send a bill in installments. It sends it all at once. The forensic audit Judge Maynard ordered hit the books within the week. The Delaware transfers had been structured to dodge $940,000 in Georgia state tax through the trust shell. A state tax lien attached to every asset by Friday. And then the floodgates opened, the way they always do once one person stops being afraid. Renata Cho went first. The former production manager who had sat very still in front of her television called the station the morning after the verdict and asked to speak on the record. She came in with a banker's boss. Inside it, her own coerced non-compete, signed beside a mixing bowl in the same Buckhead kitchen 4 years before Clara's. A stack of formula sheets in her handwriting that had ended up on Vance patent applications under Julian's name. And a resignation letter she'd never been brave enough to make public because the covenant had threatened to bankrupt her if she ever baked again within 100 miles. I thought I was the only one, she told the camera, steady, dry-eyed. I spent 4 years thinking it was something wrong with me. It wasn't. It was the contract. It was him. She was not the only one. 2 more former employees came forward within the week with the same shape of story. Their hands, his patents, their names on nothing. Then a wholesale distributor produced emails in which Julian had threatened to blacklist any supplier who dealt with the churchwoman. The national morning program ran a follow-up. The investigation clip crossed 4.1 million views in 51 hours. A boycott hashtag trended for 9 days. And the bank that had once shaded Arthur Ellison's neighborhood red, the same institution, 3 corporate names later, that had financed Julian's expansion, issued a press release distancing itself from Vance Bakeries, then quietly called the loan the red pencil and the frozen account, 64 years apart, signed by the same kind of hand. The Fulton County District Attorney opened a tax fraud inquiry into Vance Enterprises Corp. The State Labor Board opened a separate file on the pattern of coerced covenanters, and a state representative who had watched the whole thing unfold on the morning program stood up on the floor of the Georgia General Assembly and introduced a bill. She called it on the record after the case to bar non-compete agreements against unpaid spouses and low-wage workers, the exact instrument Julian had used to cage 2 women beside 2 mixing bowls. The bill did not pass that session. It passed the next one. A reporter asked Clara for comment. She said she had no comment. She had a batch in the oven, and she hung up the phone to go pull it. That answer ran in 3 papers. St. Meat, Jude's congregation, deeded the property to a new non-profit. The Avery Street Artisans Trust, run jointly by Clara and, this is the part that matters, Beatrice, whose lien the court had voided as the very instrument of the coercion it punished. The two women who had stood on opposite sides of a chain-link fence now ran the place together. That is its own kind of justice. The kind that doesn't fit on a verdict sheet. The trust opened a paid apprenticeship for laid-off and formerly incarcerated workers in the neighborhood, funded entirely by the bread. Hector took the first night shift teaching slot. The city renamed the alley behind the church, Ellison Way, and on the morning they bolted the new sign to the brick. Clara stood under it with her hand over her grandfather's name and did not say anything at all, because some things you don't have words for, you just have a fire to go tend. And the ledger, Arthur's water-stained ledger with the waxed thread spine, went under glass on the wall of the new kitchen, open to the last page. To the line in a shaking hand, the dent is the secret. Measure long, tell the girl. Through all of it, Julian Vance never said he was sorry. Not once. In the deposition, a gray conference room, a court reporter's machine ticking, the forensic accountant's binders stacked between them, opposing counsel asked him plainly whether he understood that the woman across the table had developed the formulas his patents claimed. Julian adjusted his cuff over a wrist that no longer wore the Patek and said the formulas were a corporate asset the company invested in scaling. Asked whether he had threatened his own sister's home to make her spy. He said he had exercised a contractual remedy. Asked, finally, off the record but on the page, whether he had anything he wished to say to Clara. He looked at the wall for a long moment and said, "She exploited a sentimental loophole. The data was always sound, even gutted. He believed the bread had betrayed him, not the other way around. Men like that never repent. They just run out of people to bill." Meanwhile, the thing he'd called a sidewalk nuisance kept growing into something he could not have built with all his capital. The Avery Street Artisans Trust opened a paid apprenticeship, 12 weeks, real wages from day one, taught at the same brick hearth. The first class was 4 people. The city had drawn its own quiet lines around. A man 18 months out of Lee Arundel with a felony on every application he'd ever filed. A laid-off line cook. A single father from the shelter on Pryor Street. And Renata Cho, who had decided that the cure for 4 silent years was to teach somebody else to be loud. Hector took the night shift teaching slot and ran it like his abuela's kitchen. No scales until you could read. The dough by hand, no shortcuts. Nobody honest ever rushed a fire. The bread paid the wages. The wages paid the rent. The whole thing ran on exactly the kind of slow, hand-built, unscalable craft Julian had spent 12 years trying to digitize out of existence. By December, Vance Bakeries was a corpse. The European distributors withdrew inside 28 days, unwilling to attach a premium brand to a public record of fraud and coercion. The Buckhead line stopped on a Thursday afternoon. The power company shut the computerized ovens down for non-payment. The Bentley went back to the leasing company. The house on Collier Road went to municipal auction to satisfy the tax liens. Julian moved into a 1-bedroom behind a gas station in Kennesaw, 42 miles outside the city grid, and it smelled of synthetic carpet and cheap paint. The kitchen had a generic electric stove with 4 coiled burners that glowed red when you turned the dial. Julian sat in front of it on a metal folding chair and could not make it do anything. He had managed logistics for 12 years. He had never once learned to regulate the heat of a physical pan. At 5:15 one evening, he called his son. "Leo, I've got the weekend allocation. I can pick you and Mia up at the transit station Friday morning." "We can't this Friday," Leo said. Behind him, the snap of splitting wood and the low roar of a hearth. "Cold front's coming tonight. The line's already around the block. I'll get us premium seats at the theater. We can go to the mall." A pause. "Mom's pulling the Avery Street batch," Leo said. Not angry. Just somewhere else entirely. "I've got to go help her clear the ash." The line went quiet before Julian could answer. The boy had not hung up in spite. He simply disconnected, because the work at the hearth needed him, and he now lived inside a different system of time. One measured by oak logs and rising dough. A system his father could neither buy nor freeze nor patent. Julian set the phone on the metal chair and looked at the cold red coil of his electric stove. And 11 months to the day after she lit her first fire on a dead church's gravel, his ex-wife was about to step in front of a national camera. He would watch that too. Alone. In the dark. With a stove he could not light. So here is where you came in, the national TV camera. Julian, watching. And the thing he was not ready for. 11 months after the first batch, on the winter solstice, a national morning program sent a crew to St. Laban. Jude's at 40 Zeningtons. A Pencher was 24 degrees. The puddles on Northside Drive had frozen to sheets of gray ice. But inside the brick throat, the fire was absolute. Clara stood at the stone opening in her grandfather's old flannel. Sleeves rolled exactly 2 turns. Her hands dark with ash and lined with the thick calluses of a master. Leo held the wooden board. Mia sat on a crate by the woodpile, watching the smoke climb straight into the freezing stars. Beatrice worked the donation table that was now a register. Hector ran the apprentice line. Martha poured coffee for the people waiting on benches built from the same pallets Clara had once chopped with a borrowed saw. The reporter, a national correspondent now, not Marcus Bell. Though Marcus stood off to the side with his arms crossed and something proud in his face, asked Clara the question the whole country had been asking. After everything he took, the correspondent said, the company, the house, the custody, what did you have left that he couldn't reach? Clara reached into her pocket and took out the iron ruler. She did not use it to measure anymore. The 2 millimeters lived in the joints of her fingers now. She used the metal edge to clear the loose gray ash from the hearth sill, the way Arthur had, so the heat could radiate clean. He took everything that was written down, she said. She set a loaf on the stone with her bare palm. But the part that mattered was never on paper. It was in the dent. And you can't put a dent in a database. Off in a 1-bedroom behind a gas station in Kennesaw, a man watched that sentence leave her mouth on live national television and felt the last thing he owned. The belief that he had simply outsmarted a sentimental woman go cold in his chest. He was not ready for it. He had spent 12 years certain the secret was a number he could copy. He had never understood that some things only exist in the place where a hand meets a stone. The smell in that backyard was total yeast burnt oak. Caramel sugar, the exact signature Arthur Ellison built into 3 brick ovens on Avery Street 88 years before, in a neighborhood a bank tried to draw out of existence with a red pencil. It could not be digitized. It could not be filed with the Secretary of State. It could not be frozen by an injunction, because it lived only in the direct contact between a hand and a stone. Clara handed the ruler to Leo. Measure the next dozen, she said. From the dent, always 2 over. You know why? Because the fire doesn't read paper, the boy said, and laid the dough to the hammer mark. She watched his hands do what 3 generations of hands had done, and she let the camera have it. Let the whole country see. The dent was hers, the fire was hers, and no one, no court, no covenant, no man in a charcoal suit was ever going to take it again. The crew packed up around 7. The line thinned, and that is when Clara saw the woman standing at the far end of the fence. She was maybe 30, a thin coat, not warm enough for 24 degrees. A canvas bag clutched against her chest with both arms, the way you hold the only thing you have left. She was not in line. She was just standing there, watching the smoke, the way a person stands when they have run out of places to go and the smell of bread is the first warm thing they've found in a while. Clara knew that posture. She had worn it on a curb on Collier Road 11 months and a lifetime ago. Clara wiped her hands on her flannel and walked over. She did not ask the woman what happened. She knew what a sudden erasure looked like. She knew the silence that follows a signed decree. You bake? Clara asked. The woman shook her head. No. I used to do the books for my husband's shop. He kept the shop. A breath. I don't have anything. Clara looked at her for a moment. Then she reached into her pocket, took out the iron ruler, and held it out across the cold air. This is the only thing my grandfather left me, she said. It's got a dent in it. Everybody who ever saw it thought it was junk. She pressed it into the woman's hands. Come at 4 tomorrow. I'll show you how to read it. The fire doesn't care what your name's on. Neither do I. The woman's fingers closed around the metal, around the same hammer mark a black man bought for a nickel in 1961 because a bank drew a red line around his street. The same dent that measured 1,000 loaves on bare gravel. The same flaw that walked into a courtroom and turned an empire to paper. It was just an old piece of iron. And it was the only thing in this story that never once lost its value. That is the whole trick, if you were looking for it. Julian thought worth was the name on the deed, the title on the share, the number in the Delaware account, so he spent 12 years collecting all of it, and the day a forensic auditor opened the books, every bit of it turned to dust in his hands. Clara's grandfather knew the other thing. Worth is what your hands can still do on bare gravel with nothing but a flame. They can take the paper. They can never take the dent. 42 miles away, a man sat in front of a cold electric stove he could not light, watching a woman he had erased hand her grandfather's ruler to a stranger on national television. He had taken the bakery, the vans, the house, the children, and $35 worth of everything she owned, and he was not ready. He would never be ready for the one thing he could not take, because the fire belonged to her. It always had. This was never a story about a bakery brand climbing a stock chart. It was a story about what they can and can't actually take from you. A man used every legal instrument money can buy to steal a woman's company, her home, even her children, and he buried himself in his own paperwork doing it. Because here's the quiet truth he never figured out. Your real worth was never the thing somebody else put your name on. It's the thing your hands know how to do when you've got nothing left but gravel and a flame. That no one can foreclose on. Real talk for a second. Most of us have been the invisible one in the room at least once. The one who built it and watched somebody else's name go on the door. The one the gallery wouldn't even look at. So, I want to ask you something straight to the comments. Who in your life showed up when nobody else did? When it would have been so much easier for them to look at the floor like everyone else? Tell me about that person below. Say their name. They earned it. If you believe the quiet ones are stronger than the loud ones, and that what you build with your own hands can never really be stolen, drop a like and subscribe, so these stories keep finding the people who need them. And share this with anyone out there carrying a fire on bare gravel right now, doing the honest work while somebody else gets the credit. Send it to them tonight. Let them know the dent is still theirs. See you in the next one.